December 15, 1858, Atlanta, Georgia. The governor's mansion blazed with golden light against the winter darkness, its windows glowing like the eyes of some great beast gorging itself on celebration. Inside, 14 of the most powerful men in the state raised crystal glasses filled with imported wine, toasting another year of prosperity built on the backs of human chattel. Outside, snow began to fall, soft, silent, and white as the lies they told themselves about their righteousness. But in the shadows of that very mansion, moving between the kitchen and the dining hall, with the practiced invisibility of the enslaved, walked a man whose name would echo through history's hidden chambers: Elijah, butler, poisoner, and architect of what would become known as the Governor's Banquet massacre. In his weathered hands he carried more than silver platters and crystal decanters. He carried the weight of memory, the fury of generations, and a chalice filled not with wine, but with justice distilled into its most potent form. Tonight, as these men celebrated their dominion over human souls, Elijah would serve them their final supper. Tonight the meek would not inherit the earth, they would reclaim it, one poisoned cup at a time. Before we continue with this tale of reckoning, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because stories like these need to be told, remembered, and passed down like sacred fire. The governor's mansion stood like a monument to stolen dreams, its marble columns gleaming white as bleached bones in the lamplight. Inside, the air hung thick with the perfume of privilege, roasted meats that could feed a dozen slave families, cigars that cost more than a field hand's yearly worth, and the cloying sweetness of imported delicacies that melted on tongues that had never known hunger. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with portraits of dead patriarchs, their painted eyes seeming to approve of this gathering of their spiritual heirs. The dining hall stretched long and wide, its mahogany table groaning under the weight of silver and gold, while outside the tall windows, the December wind howled like the voices of the ancestors calling for justice. But beneath the floorboards, in the basement kitchen where Elijah moved like a ghost among the steam and shadows, the air told a different story. Here, the walls sweated with the labor of unseen hands. Here, the very stones seemed to absorb the tears and blood of those who had built this palace of persecution. The kitchen fires burned hot and bright, but they could not warm the chill that had settled in Elijah's bones. A cold that had nothing to do with the winter wind, and everything to do with the ice that forms around a heart that has witnessed too much, endured too much, remembered too much. In the quarters beyond, past the frosted windows where no light was permitted after dark, 300 souls lay huddled in the cold, their breath visible in the frigid air, their children's stomachs hollow with hunger while the masters above feasted on the fruits of their labor. The contrast was as sharp as the blade Elijah kept hidden beneath his worn apron, a blade that tonight would taste something sweeter than the flesh it had been forced to cut. Elijah Washington, for that was the name given to him by the first master who had bought him like livestock 43 years ago, had not always been a poisoner, he had not always been a killer. There was a time when his hands had been instruments of healing, when his knowledge of roots and herbs had been used to birth babies and ease the dying into their final sleep with dignity. Born in the tobacco fields of Virginia to a woman whose Yoruba name was swallowed by the Atlantic and replaced with Sarah, Elijah had learned the language of plants from his grandmother, Old Nana, whose back bore the raised scars of rebellion and whose eyes held the memory of a homeland across the water. She had taught him that every growing thing held power, to heal or to harm, to give life or to take it away. The difference, she would whisper as they gathered herbs by moonlight, lies not in the plant, but in the hand that uses it, and the heart that guides that hand. By the age of 12, Elijah could ease a fever with willow bark, stop bleeding with plantain, and bring sleep to the restless with chamomile and valerian. The masters had valued this skill, trading him from plantation to plantation like a prized tool, never understanding that with each transaction, each separation from those he had grown to love, they were forging something harder and sharper in his soul. It was on the Thornfield plantation in South Carolina that Elijah first learned the other uses of his gift. He was 22 then, newly arrived and already marked by the quiet dignity that made him dangerous in the eyes of those who needed their slaves broken. The overseer, a man named Dutch Macready, whose breath reeked of whiskey and whose hands left bruises on everything they touched, had taken a particular interest in a young woman named Keturah. Even now, 36 years later, Elijah could conjure her face with perfect clarity, the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed, the grace with which she moved despite the weight of chains, the songs she hummed while washing clothes by the river. She had been promised to him, their union blessed by the elder women who understood that love was one of the few freedoms that could not be stolen. But promises meant nothing to men like Macready. Power was their only sacrament, and they worshipped at its altar with the zealotry of the truly damned. The night Macready took Keturah to his cabin, Elijah stood at the edge of the clearing and listened to her screams echo across the cotton fields. He listened, and he learned. He learned that some wounds cut deeper than the whip. He learned that there are violations that break more than the body. And he learned that sometimes healing requires cutting away what is diseased, even if that disease wears the face of a man. 3 days later, Macready died in agony, his body convulsing as the carefully prepared tea worked its way through his system. The mushrooms Elijah had gathered looked so similar to the edible ones that even he had trouble telling them apart, until they were dried, ground, and mixed with just enough honey to mask their bitter taste. The plantation owner mourned the loss of his overseer, attributed his death to a weak constitution, and never suspected the quiet healer who had prepared his final meal. But Keturah was already gone, sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana to pay Macready's gambling debts. Elijah never saw her again, though he carried her memory like a sacred relic, letting it harden into something sharp and bright in the darkness of his chest. The years that followed were a catalogue of small deaths and smaller victories. Masters who mysteriously fell ill after particularly brutal whippings. Overseers who choked on their own vomit after nights of drinking and violence. Each death was a prayer offered up to the ancestors. Each carefully administered dose of justice was a promise kept to those who could no longer speak for themselves. By the time Elijah was purchased by Governor Thomas Whitmore for his Atlanta mansion, his reputation as a healer had preceded him. What the governor didn't know was that Elijah had also learned to read, first by watching the plantation children at their lessons, then by studying every medical text and botanical guide he could lay his hands on. He had memorized the properties of every plant that grew in the southern soil, cataloged their uses, and refined his understanding of dosage and timing until he could kill as easily as he could cure. The governor's mansion became Elijah's laboratory. In the root cellar, behind barrels of flour and preserved meats, he cultivated his garden of retribution. Castor beans for ricin, oleander for cardiac glycosides, water hemlock for sicutoxin. Each plant was tended with the care of a devoted gardener, each harvest calculated to the gram. For 3 years, Elijah had watched and waited, studying the patterns of power like a naturalist observing dangerous predators. He learned Governor Whitmore's schedule, his preferences, his weaknesses. He memorized the faces of the men who visited the mansion, politicians who spoke of states' rights while counting human property like livestock, businessmen who had built their fortunes on unpaid labor, judges who interpreted law through the lens of white supremacy. 14 men. 14 pillars of a system built on stolen lives and broken dreams. 14 demons who had convinced themselves they were gentlemen, who slept peacefully in beds paid for with blood and tears while the people they owned shivered in quarters not fit for livestock. The plan had taken shape slowly, like a photograph developing in chemicals. It would have to be perfect, not just in execution, but in symbolism. These men, who had spent their lives deciding the fate of others over dinner and drinks, would meet their judgment in the same manner. They would die as they had lived, gorging themselves on what did not belong to them, never suspecting that their final feast was being served by the hand of justice itself. Elijah had studied each man like a physician studies a disease, cataloging their crimes and calculating their punishment with the precision of a chemist. Governor Whitmore, who had personally overseen the auction where 300 souls were sold to pay for his mansion's marble floors. Senator Caldwell, who had written the legislation that made it legal to hunt escaped slaves like animals. Judge Morrison, who had sentenced a mother to death for teaching her children to read. Banker Rothschild, who had financed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Each had earned their place at this table through their dedication to human misery. Each would receive their due with the same attention to detail they had applied to their own cruelties. The poisoner's art requires patience, precision, and an understanding of the human body that rivals any physician's. But more than that, it requires a soul that has been refined by suffering until it becomes something harder than steel and more patient than stone. Elijah possessed all of these qualities in abundance. For weeks he had been preparing, not just the poisons, though those required careful cultivation and extraction, but the delivery system itself. The wine would be the primary vehicle, but Elijah was too careful to rely on a single method. The bread would be dusted with ricin. The meat would be basted with oleander extract. Even the butter would carry its own secret cargo of death. He had tested each preparation on the mansion's rats, adjusting dosages and timing until he achieved the desired effect. Too little, and his targets might survive to exact revenge. Too much, and they would die too quickly, robbing him of the opportunity to watch them understand what was happening to them. Tonight was December 15th, the anniversary of the day Keturah had been sold away from him. Tonight, as these 14 men gathered to celebrate another year of profitable cruelty, they would instead drink from the chalice of their own making. They had taught him that power was the only law, that might made right, that human lives were commodities to be bought and sold. Tonight, he would demonstrate that he had learned their lessons well. In his quarters, Elijah had written no confession, made no speeches, prepared no defenses. The dying would speak for itself. His actions would be his testimony, and the silence that followed would be his victory. The wine had been his masterpiece, a vintage imported from France at tremendous expense, its deep red color perfect for disguising the darker additives he had stirred into each bottle. Water hemlock with its sweet smell that mimicked parsnip mixed with ricin extracted from castor beans grown in his secret garden. The combination would work slowly at first, allowing the men to enjoy their meal, their conversation, their sense of superiority. Only when it was too late to purge their systems would they begin to understand that they were not the pre-daters at this table. But the wine was merely the opening movement of this symphony of retribution. The bread, baked fresh that morning, had been kneaded with flour that contained microscopic traces of death-cap mushrooms. Not enough to kill quickly, but sufficient to ensure that even those who drank sparingly would not escape. The roasted fowl had been basted with a glaze that contained concentrated foxglove, its cardiac glycosides designed to stop hearts that had never known mercy. Each dish was a chapter in the story of their crimes, each course a verse in the ballad of their judgment. As Elijah moved through the final preparations, polishing silver that would soon be stained with more than wine, he thought of all the faces that would never see justice through legal means. The children sold away from their mothers, the women violated by men who called themselves Christians, the men worked to death in fields that would never know their names. Tonight he carried their voices with him. Tonight he was not just Elijah the butler, the healer, the slave. Tonight he was the instrument of a justice that transcended human law, the vessel of a reckoning that had been building for generations. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, its bronze voice echoing through the mansion like a funeral bell. In the dining room above, 14 men took their seats around the mahogany table, their faces flushed with wine and winter wind, their voices raised in laughter that would soon turn to screams. Elijah adjusted his white gloves, straightened his black coat, and lifted the silver tray that held their destiny. He didn't run, he didn't shout, he didn't pray. He simply climbed the servants' stairs with the measured pace of a man who had found his purpose, carrying death disguised as hospitality, justice masquerading as service. The dining room blazed with light and laughter as Elijah entered, his footsteps silent on the Persian carpet that had cost more than most slaves would see in a lifetime. The 14 men barely glanced at him. To them, he was furniture with legs, a shadow that existed only to fulfill their needs. They had no idea they were looking at their executioner. Governor Whitmore raised his glass, his face red with drink and righteousness. "Gentlemen," he boomed, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never been denied anything, "to another year of prosperity and proper order." "To prosperity," the chorus echoed, 14 voices united in their greed, 14 hands lifting crystal glasses filled with their own damnation. Elijah watched them drink, his face a mask of perfect servility, while his heart thundered with the rhythm of justice delayed but not denied. The wine went down smooth, its French elegance disguising the bitter taste of retribution. Some men took small sips, savoring the expensive vintage. Others, like Judge Morrison, drained their glasses in single gulps, already reaching for the bottle to pour another. 20 minutes passed. Conversation flowed as freely as the wine, topics ranging from the price of cotton to the upcoming legislative session. Senator Caldwell was in the middle of a story about a recent slave auction when the first symptoms began to manifest. It started with Judge Morrison, whose gluttony had always been his weakness, a slight tremor in his left hand, barely noticeable at first, then a flush that spreads across his face like sunrise over a battlefield. He set down his glass with hands that suddenly seemed uncertain, his eyes narrowing as if trying to focus on something that kept slipping away. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, his voice slightly slurred, "I believe I may have indulged a bit too freely." His words trailed off as his body began to convulse, subtle at first, then with increasing violence. One by one, the others began to follow. Banker Rothschild clutched his chest, his breath coming in short gasps as the cardiac glycosides began their work. Governor Whitmore tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing into the table with a sound like thunder. Crystal shattered, wine spilled like blood across white linen, and the air filled with the sounds of grown men reduced to their most basic animal functions. Elijah stood in the corner, his hands clasped behind his back, watching with the detached interest of a physician observing the progression of a disease. This was not cruelty. This was precision. This was not murder. This was justice served at exactly the right temperature, in exactly the right portions, to exactly the right recipients. Senator Caldwell, who had written laws that made it legal to separate children from their mothers, now wept like a child himself as his nervous system began to shut down. His body jerked and spasmed, his face contorting into expressions of agony that mirrored those he had inflicted on countless others. The irony was not lost on Elijah, who had watched slave mothers die of grief when their babies were sold away. The room filled with the sounds of retching, gasping, and the animal moans of men who had finally encountered a power greater than their own. Some tried to crawl toward the door, their dignity abandoned in the face of approaching death. Others simply lay where they had fallen, their eyes wide with the terrible understanding that their time of reckoning had come. Judge Morrison was the first to die, his body going rigid before collapsing in a heap beside his overturned chair. His eyes, which had looked upon human bondage and called it law, stared sightlessly at the ceiling while his mouth hung open in a final silent scream. Governor Whitmore lasted longer, his constitution strengthened by years of the finest food and medical care that money could buy. But even he could not fight the inevitable. As the toxins claimed his nervous system, he looked directly at Elijah with eyes that held the dawning recognition of who and what his faithful butler had truly been. "You," he gasped, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth, "you did this." Elijah stepped forward, his movements graceful and unhurried. He knelt beside the dying governor, his face calm as a priest giving last rites. "Yes, sir," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "I did this, just like you taught me to do. You taught me that some lives matter more than others. You taught me that power makes right. You taught me that the strong survive by consuming the weak." He reached out and gently closed the governor's staring eyes. "I learned my lessons well." One by one they died, some quickly, their hearts stopping like clocks whose springs had snapped. Others slowly, their bodies fighting against the inevitable until their strength gave out. By the time the grandfather clock chimed midnight, 14 men who had ruled over thousands lay still and cold in their own opulence, their fins. A feast spread across the floor in a tableau of justice served. Elijah moved through the carnage with practiced efficiency, closing eyes, folding hands, arranging bodies with the same care he had once given to healing. These men had lived without dignity. He would at least allow them to die with it, not because they deserved it, but because he was not them. He was something they had never been and never could be, truly human. The discovery came at dawn when the household cook arrived to prepare breakfast and found the dining room transformed into a charnel house. Her screams echoed through the mansion, rousing the other servants and sending word racing through Atlanta like wildfire. By noon, the city was in chaos. By evening, the governor's mansion was surrounded by soldiers, reporters, and crowds of white citizens calling for blood. They found Elijah in his quarters, sitting calmly on his narrow bed, reading from a Bible that had been given to him by old Nana decades ago. He made no attempt to run, offered no resistance when they shackled his wrists, showed no emotion when they dragged him through streets filled with screaming voices and raised fists. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted 3 days. The courtroom was packed with spectators hungry for spectacle, their faces twisted with a bloodlust that revealed the thin veneer of their civilization. They wanted him to break, to beg, to provide them with the entertainment of watching a slave grovel for mercy they had no intention of granting. Instead, they got something that disturbed them far more than any plea for forgiveness could have: dignity. Elijah sat straight in his chair, answered questions with quiet honesty, and refused to apologize for actions he believed were justified. When asked why he had killed 14 innocent men, he looked directly at the judge, a man who owned 3 plantations and 200 slaves, and spoke words that would be remembered long after his body had returned to dust. "Innocent?" he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "Your Honor, with respect, I must disagree with your characterization. These men were many things: powerful, wealthy, influential, but innocent was not among them. They were guilty of crimes that no court in this land would ever prosecute. They were guilty of treating human beings like livestock. They were guilty of separating mothers from children, husbands from wives, families from each other. They were guilty of rape, torture, and murder. But because their victims were black, their guilt was transformed into virtue in the eyes of the law." He paused, looking around the courtroom at faces that had gone pale with rage and recognition. "You ask me why I killed them. I killed them because they taught me to kill. Every auction block was a lesson in violence. Every whipping post was a tutorial in cruelty. Every family separated was a masterclass in heartbreak. I simply applied what they taught me and used it to level a playing field that had been tilted in their favor for far too long." The judge sentenced him to death, of course. The outcome had never been in doubt. But as they led him from the courtroom, Elijah walked with his head high, his shoulders straight, his spirit unbroken. He had done what he set out to do. He had struck a blow for justice that would echo through history, even if that history was written by his enemies. The execution was scheduled for dawn on January 15th, exactly 1 month after the governor's banquet. They built the gallows in the town square, expecting to draw a crowd that would celebrate the death of the man who had dared to strike back at the system that oppressed him. What they got instead was something different, something that worried them more than any riot could have. They got silence. In the pre-dawn darkness, Elijah was led from his cell to the scaffold, his wrists bound, his neck measured for the rope. But as the sun rose over Atlanta, painting the sky the color of blood, something extraordinary happened. The square filled not with the jeering crowds the authorities had expected, but with hundreds of enslaved people who had somehow managed to slip away from their quarters, their plantations, their duties. They came without weapons, without anger, without the violence their oppressors had taught them to expect from themselves. They came bearing witness, standing in silent testimony to the man who had done what they had all dreamed of doing but never dared attempt. They came to honor not his methods, but his courage, not his violence, but his refusal to accept that violence was something that could only flow in one direction. As Elijah climbed the steps to the gallows, he looked out over the sea of brown faces and felt, for the first time in his life, that he was truly home. These were his people, not by blood, but by shared suffering, not by choice, but by common cause. And in their eyes, he saw not condemnation, but understanding, not judgment, but respect. The rope was placed around his neck, the hood drawn over his eyes. In the moment before the trapdoor opened, Elijah spoke his final words, his voice carrying clearly over the silent crowd. "I go to meet my ancestors with my head held high. I go knowing that somewhere, somehow, the children of slaves will walk free. I go knowing that the seeds of justice, once planted, cannot be uprooted by any force on earth. And I go knowing that every master who closes his eyes tonight will wonder if his trusted servant, his faithful butler, his loyal slave, might be the next to decide that enough is enough. The trapdoor opened, the rope went taut, and Elijah Washington died as he had lived in his final years, on his own terms, unbowed and unbroken. But death was not the end of Elijah's story, it was the beginning of his legend. Within weeks, whispers began to spread through slave quarters across the South. Stories of the butler who had served justice instead of dinner, tales of the poisoner who had turned the master's own feast into their funeral. Legends of the man who had proven that even the most powerless could find a way to strike back. The stories grew in the telling, as stories do. Some said Elijah's ghost haunted the governor's mansion, that servants could hear his footsteps in the night, still carrying out his eternal duty. Others claimed that he had taught his secrets to a network of servants who continued his work, that masters across the South were dying mysterious deaths that could be traced to their own dinner tables. Whether these stories were true mattered less than what they represented: hope. For a people who had been taught that resistance was futile, that submission was their only option, the story of Elijah Washington became a beacon of possibility. It whispered that power was not absolute, that oppression was not permanent, that even the mightiest could fall. In the quarters, mothers would tell their children about the butler who said no. In the fields, workers would hum songs about the man who turned the master's own weapons against them. In the kitchens, cooks would handle their knives with new awareness, understanding that the tools of service could become the instruments of justice. The authorities tried to suppress the stories, to erase Elijah's name from history, to pretend that the Governor's Banquet massacre had never happened. But stories like this don't die easily. They live in the spaces between words, in the pauses between heartbeats, in the silence that speaks louder than any scream. And so Elijah Washington became something more than a man. He became a symbol, a whisper, a reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied, only justice disguised, waiting for its moment to emerge from the shadows and demand its due. The poison in the chalice had done more than kill 14 men. It had poisoned the very foundations of a system built on the assumption that some people were born to serve and others to be served. It had infected the comfortable certainty of oppressors with the uncomfortable knowledge that their victims were watching, learning, and remembering. In the end, that was Elijah's greatest victory. Not the deaths he had caused, but the fear he had awakened, the doubt he had sown, the questions he had forced into minds that preferred easy answers. He had proven that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched, was immune to the corrosive power of justice deferred but not denied. His chalice had contained more than poison. It had contained the distilled essence of every tear shed, every cry silenced, every dream deferred, and when those 14 men drank from it, they tasted not just their own death, but the accumulated weight of every life they had helped to destroy. What does it mean to serve a poisoned chalice to those who have poisoned an entire society? What violence lies buried beneath the sugar of our civilization? Whose cries have become the seasoning for our comfort? These are the questions that Elijah's story forces us to confront, not to glorify violence, but to understand its roots, to recognize its inevitability when justice is denied for too long. His legacy lives on not in the deaths he caused, but in the dignity he maintained, the courage he demonstrated, and the truth he revealed. That even in the darkest chapters of human history, there are those who refuse to accept that darkness is permanent. They become the light that guides others toward freedom, the whisper behind the stove that says resistance is possible, the ghost in the mansion that reminds the powerful that their power is not eternal. Elijah Washington died at the end of a rope, but his spirit lives on in every act of resistance, every refusal to accept injustice, every moment when the oppressed choose dignity over safety and truth over comfort. He reminds us that freedom is not a gift to be granted by the powerful, but a right to be claimed by the powerless, one poisoned chalice at a time if necessary. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth. It really helps the channel keep bringing real stories that never make it into the history books. Because these stories, these voices that have been silenced, these acts of resistance that have been erased, these moments of courage that have been forgotten, they deserve to be remembered, they deserve to be told, and they deserve to echo through history until justice is no longer something that must be served in secret, in silence, in the dark spaces where the oppressed transform their pain into power and their suffering into strength.